I get on to the next bit, I'd just like to take a few moments to consider some of the terms used when we talk about this era, as they can be a little bit confusing. And I'm aware that I've been throwing them about, bandying them about freely, and without much concern for their definition. Now, over the course of a century, what we see is a shift in the terms used to describe those individuals who made it their job to treat the mentally disturbed. And I'd like to go over those terms as they are, like just about everything else, historically determined. In the 18th century, as we've already seen, the common designation was mad doctor. By the early 19th century, the alienist had come into vogue. This was an expression derived from Pinel's belief that when an individual suffered from madness, they were alienated from their true selves. William Tuke, the Quaker founder of the Retreat, admired Pinel's expression so much that he brought the word into the English language as an expression for those who treated the mad in madhouses or the newly emergent asylums, with the implication that it was the job of the alienist to restore the mad to their true selves. Right the way into the second half of the 19th century, alienist was the preferred designation for what was once a mad doctor, although the psychiatrist was introduced from Germany in the early part of that century and would become increasingly popular as the 19th century progressed as a description for those medically qualified doctors who treated the mentally ill. One more piece of terminology to consider. Let us ponder the meaning of the term asylum. Because of its long history and the abuses that emerged within its walls, it became a word of foreboding. As a kid, I remember driving to school in Haywards Heath in Sussex, just on the outskirts of the town, a few miles from the school. The local asylum stood atop the fringe of a low hill. It was to us a place of fear, as architecture and as a word. To be placed in the asylum was to be put beyond the bounds of society, beyond normal, and the idea that one might cross the threshold was mired in fear. But in reality, when the term was first employed to describe a hospital for treating the mentally ill, it meant exactly the same as it does now in the wider context of the word's meaning. So when we use the expression asylum seeker, we're describing people who are looking for a place of refuge, a place of sanctuary and of protection. And that was exactly what an asylum for the mentally ill was supposed to do, provide a place of retreat where an individual's disturbed world could be set back to rights. However, before we move on to the asylum, I'd just like to recap some of the issues that we dealt with. In the 18th and through to the 19th century, the vast majority of pauper lunatics were treated either at home or within the workhouse, or poorhouse as they were sometimes called. The picture you see here is of the village that I grew up in. It looks English idyllic. You can tell the old age of the building at the bottom of the street, and it looks beautiful. When I grew up, it was where the printing press was housed. But way before that, it had been the workhouse, where those who could not work, either through age or infirmity, were housed at the parish's expense. Who knows how many mad people lived and died there. And then there was the range of different types of institutions. The large public hospitals like St Luke's and Bedlam, local public madhouses in cities like York, and then the large private madhouses like Hoxton, and of course there were the many more smaller institutions. And just as there was a wide variety of institutions, there was an equally wide variety of conditions experienced by those confined within these institutions. If we take the paradigmatic madhouse Bedlam, existing for hundreds of years, and a byword under the care of the Munros for the spectacle of madness, the opening up of the asylum to the general public for a fee, a place of entertainment, but also somewhere where the old-style brutal treatment of lunatics remained in place throughout the 18th century. The treatment of William Norris in particular became an icon of the brutality of the older style of madhouse. However, there were those other institutions that were edging towards the new style moral therapy, including Brislington House and Grateford Hall. Witness the dramatist Reynolds talking about his impressions of Grateford Hall. The unprepared traveller was astonished to find almost all the surrounding ploughmen, gardeners, threshers, thatchers, and other labourers attired in black coats, white waistcoats, black silk breeches and stockings, and the head of each bien poudré, frissé, et arrangé. These were the doctor's patients. Note the surprise, the fact of how respectable they looked, the fact that he couldn't tell that these people were lunatics. The bottom line was that if you could pay, you were, on the whole, likely to be better treated than if you could not. And then there was the emergence of moral therapy itself, captured in the legend of Pinel, the unchaining that didn't really happen, and also of Tuke and Chirurgi, all of whom sought, one way or another, to target reason through the emotions of the patient and through the authority of the mad doctor. However, it's probably best to see the movement as part of a general shift in thinking brought about by Enlightenment philosophy and a new emphasis on psychology and individualism, rather than stemming from just one person or just one place. This was of a piece with prison reform, which became so critical at the end of the 18th century, with individuals like John Howard pushing for a change in the way that punishment was used, pushing for a more humane and rational form of punishment. And, of course, the other great movement, perhaps the greatest of the movements of the time, the abolition of slavery. And these all represent a new perspective on the rights and freedom of individuals and what was and was not permissible in terms of the way that bodies and minds in these different contexts were treated. In Britain, after the horrors of Bedlam and Hoxton and other places had been revealed, and with the voice of reform growing ever louder, legislation was enacted to enable the construction of large public asylums to be run along the lines of moral therapy. And gradually, the institutions started sprouting up, usually with a superintendent in charge, who abolished restraints as a symbol of enlightened moral therapy. This is certainly what Connolly did when he was appointed to Hanwell, the Middlesex County Asylum, along with the introduction of entertainments, balls, dinners, the humanising of the patients. We can briefly examine the timeline of moral therapy's existence within the asylum, point by point, and note the rapid expansion that occurred from the 1840s onwards as the success of Connolly and the other moral therapists was trumpeted loudly across Europe and into the Americas. The heyday, indeed the halcyon days of the asylum, was the period from 1840 to 1870. The promise of cure, of therapeutic optimism, infused the enterprise. Initially, it might have been seen as a measure of the asylum's success that as fast as they could be built, the beds would fill up. But by the 1870s, the initial outpouring of optimism had waned, and individuals like Henry Maudsley, Connolly's son-in-law, turned from asylum practice to the neurologist's consulting rooms. From around about that point it was, as we will see, downhill all the way for moral therapy. But let us return to the optimism-fueled 1840s, and where better to look than our friend Charles Dickens on a tour to the United States, on a mission to boost his popularity and sales, while at the same time to be a purveyor of high-class reportage. As in Britain, the movement of moral therapy was afoot, the triumph of the system loudly proclaimed, and for a visitor like Dickens or other journalists, it was wondrous. The thought that such institutions could cure madness, that where there was once brutality and violence, there was now order and peace. The trust in any human being, with or without reason, was amply repaid, even down to the civilizing effects of eating with knives and forks like bourgeois diners. Trust them to be civilized, and their reason will return.